Happy Friday. This has been a wild week of news, particularly from our nation's capital. You can go snowblind trying to look at any given piece of what's been happening inside the Beltway and swirling around the White House these past few days. But while we are following the chaos at the White House and Congress and mushrooming indictments and the Russia investigation and the gun controversy and all the rest of it, very different and every bit as urgent news has continued to develop halfway around the world. North Korea and the Kim dynasty have been a national security headache for America and American presidents since the end of the Korean War. But North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons means they are now on the verge of being not just a headache, but a real global threat. And it is not clear that any American president has had a terrific answer for this problem. Over the past couple of weeks, we've seen this current president impose yet more sanctions, which he then followed by sending his daughter, somewhat incongruously, to personally brief the South Korean president about those sanctions. And then just a day later, we learned that his daughter had just been stripped of her security clearance. But as I say, nobody's had the perfect response. Tonight, I'm excited to say we've got the perfect person to show us what is actually going on inside the American standoff with North Korea, and crucially, how the North was able to get as far as they did with their nuclear ambitions. Some of what you're about to see is going to surprise you. NBC's chief foreign correspondent, my friend Richard Engel, has spent his career reporting on conflict and intrigue around the world. Tonight, he's really got something, and he is reporting from Seoul, South Korea. Here now is On Assignment with Richard Engel.
Welcome. It's Saturday morning in Seoul, South Korea. As Rachel just said, I have spent a lot of time covering conflicts. But one thing I didn't expect to be reporting on is the possibility, even the remote possibility, of a nuclear conflict. But here I am, and that's what we're doing. Talking about rising tensions with a nuclear-armed North Korea. Now, North Korea is a small, poor, isolated country with very limited resources. But in my hotel room the other day, I watched Vladimir Putin, the president of the world's second largest nuclear power, make a presentation that included a slide showing a nuclear strike on Florida. Experts say he may well be bluffing to whip up his supporters, but it doesn't take a concerned scientist to tell you that the threat of nuclear war is back and with a vengeance. We'll have a concerned scientist or two on the show, and the story of a very brave young woman who escaped from North Korea when she was just 13. But first, we have a story that shows how these two threats from Russia and North Korea are connected. We got our hands on a partial copy of a report that is due to be released by the UN later this month. It was prepared by a team of experts who monitor North Korea to see if it's complying with the sanctions. You won't be surprised to hear that the short answer is no. The full report is more than 200 pages long and details a whole litany of allegations that the North Koreans are helping the Syrian government's missile and chemical weapons program, that they're selling missiles to the military in Myanmar, and are generally involved in all kinds of dirty business. The report says that the North Koreans smuggled out nearly $200 million worth of goods in just 9 months last year. This money is helping immensely to keep the regime in power and its weapons program going. The report specifically mentioned several cases where coal was smuggled out of North Korea through Russia. Now, that got our attention because we've been investigating illicit trade from North Korea for a while. In fact, we just got back from a reporting trip to Vladivostok in the far eastern corner of Russia.
Late night at Moscow's Yaroslavsky station. Calling all passengers for the legendary Trans-Siberian Railway. This train is not the fastest way to get to Russia's Far East, but it is the most dramatic. It runs over 5,700 miles of track across 8 time zones, 16 rivers, and more than 80 cities and towns before arriving finally in Vladivostok. We were welcomed by Professor Artyom Lukin from a local state university. I asked him the question that brought us here.
We've heard reports that Russia is helping North Korea evade sanctions. Is that true?
I've seen such reports, but they're just allegations. What sense does it make for Russia to help North Korea violate the sanctions?
Lukin, who doesn't officially speak for the government but rarely disagrees with the Kremlin, told me that Vladivostok is so close to where the North Koreans do their nuclear tests that the last one shook his apartment building. This is a part of Russia the world rarely sees. Vladivostok still feels very Soviet. It's gritty, and this time of year, freezing cold.
This is the far eastern edge of Russia, where the Asian continent ends and the now frozen sea begins. And although this area may look completely blocked off right now by the ice, this is actually an essential shipping route.
Ports are the main engine of the economy here. Cars, timber, scrap metal, seafood. There are ships being loaded and offloaded everywhere. We had been tracking a Russian ship called the Vityaz. In mid-October, according to logs we had obtained, it started heading out to sea and then disappeared, probably by turning off its transponder.
It is very unusual for this beacon, this AIS as it's known, to be turned off. And that in itself is a powerful indicator of criminal activity or sanctions-busting activity.
Former CIA officer Norman Roule spent more than 30 years in intelligence gathering. Now he works for an organization that tracks international sanctions violations and has been comparing the movements of the Vityaz with those of a North Korean ship that was in the same area at the same time.
And the activities each conducted had some common characteristics. First, they turned off the transponder. Second, they left traditional shipping lanes. Third, they went to an area of water near North Korea where ships don't usually go. So now, when you put this data together, this is so unusual that these two ships certainly deserve more investigation.
The tracking data doesn't reveal the nature of the cargo it was carrying, but Reuters quoted 2 European security officials who said the Vityaz transferred 1,600 tons of oil to the North Korean ship. Whatever the cargo was, Roule says, these maps tell a very familiar story.
It is very likely that this was a ship-to-ship transfer, similar ships, similar size, approximately same time, going to a very unusual area.
A few days after it disappeared, the Vityaz reappeared in Russia. We wanted to see if it was still here.
We're looking for a ship called Vityaz.
She will check now.
She'll check? Wonderful.
The guard remembered seeing the ship coming into port, but when she checked the records, the ship's name wasn't on them.
Is there someone we can reach out to talk to who owns the ship? Do you know who brought it here? Is there a register name of the owner or something like that? Can we go in and see it?
Нет.
So we couldn't get in, but at least we did confirm that the ship is in fact here. Now we have to find a way to get to it.
We did eventually find a way to get to the Vityaz and capture these images. Neither the company that owns it nor Russian authorities responded when we asked why the ghost ship wasn't recorded on the port's books. Next, we set off to search for 2 more ships, both Chinese-owned. This satellite image from this past summer shows one of them, the Sun Union, at a local port. Nothing unusual about that, except that it looks like it made a secret stop on the way there.
According to the manifest, the ship, once it left its last commercial stop, was going straight to the port of Nakhudka. But somewhere in that distance, it took on additional cargo because the ship was lower in the water. Its draft changed. So it's proof, it's evidence the ship took on additional cargo, almost certainly from North Korea.
Another satellite image shows another Chinese ship, Great Spring, in the same port at the same time.
They're next to each other, literally next to each other, for one day. The profile would fit the storyline of a ship undertaking commercial activity as a cover, stops in North Korea, picks up a cargo, and then looks for a buyer, finds a buyer, and the buyer takes the goods on to China.
The second slide, which
That cargo, according to the U.S. Treasury Department, was coal. The department presented its evidence to a House committee back in September.
It's highly suspicious. This is exactly the type of activity you would look for if you were seeking to identify sanctions busting.
And yet, Great Spring was not sanctioned, and we found it and filmed it here in Russia, ready for the next load. No Russian official was willing to discuss our findings, so we went yet again to see Artyom Lukin.
When we last met, I asked you whether Russia was helping North Korea evade sanctions, and you said absolutely not. You said there's no evidence, no proof, correct?
Yeah.
We went out and saw some of these ships sitting in Russian harbors, the same ships allegedly going back and forth, bringing goods illegally into North Korea.
Well, how could you know? Have you looked inside the ship? I have not personally seen any credible evidence.
Roule, who's looked at the evidence closely, says it's very credible.
No one turns off their transponder for routine activity. No one leaves an international shipping lane for routine activity.
The question is whether they transport prohibited, banned goods and substances.
Our understanding is they were shipping coal and oil.
Coal and oil.
Coal coming from North Korea, oil going back. And under the new sanctions, those would be prohibited items.
So, Richard, even if what you're saying is really true, do you think they would make huge difference to North Korea?
There is, of course, no way of knowing the answer to that question, but North Korea is starved for cash and weapons parts, which means any prescribed trade, whether it's imports or exports, that can raise foreign currency could help the regime's weapons program.
It's a good thing to remember that ships go in two directions. And the North Koreans have a long history of seeking, whenever possible, Western technology to support their weapons program.
If there's evidence, like we've seen evidence, that there is smuggling of at least fuel between Russia and North Korea, isn't it possible that other things, like weapons components, could also be smuggled?
Well, Richard, frankly, no offense to you, but you are a journalist. You are not a sanctions expert.
Roule, of course, is a sanctions expert.
When you have, again, similar ships of a similar size in a similar period of time, leaving shipping lanes, going to an unusual part of the nearby waters, turning off their transponders, you have more than sufficient reason to say that these entities deserve serious and significant monitoring and investigation.
There was one more ship we wanted to find in Vladivostok, a North Korean ferry, but it wasn't there. Russian authorities stopped it and sent it back to North Korea on suspicion that it was carrying illegal goods, including ones that could have military use.
Hello.
We went to see the ferry's Russian operator, Vladimir Baranov.
Has this ship, your ship, the Mangibon, ever moved weapons components?
Нет, и это не
You say, niet, 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 no way, no way. But you also say you don't inspect the cargo. So how do you know what you're carrying?
Здесь, во Владивостоке,
Baranov admitted that he didn't, but claimed that American agents with cameras were watching the port closely. If we were really doing something wrong, he said, our ferry would be on the sanction list. Everyone we spoke to in Vladivostok was convinced that the Americans were watching everything. And yet, none of the ships had been sanctioned.
I think it's impossible to deal with the North Korean problem without addressing the Russian aspects of this issue and looking at Russian firms, ports, facilities that aid these ships, companies that own these ships, and placing them under the same scrutiny that you would apply to other countries in the region.
Lukin insisted Russia has no interest in helping North Korea develop its weapons program, but says Russia also doesn't want to help the U.S. bring North Korea to its knees.
Well, the problem is, to my mind, that the U.S. would like to impose, total blockade on North Korea, just to strangle the country. And of course, Russia would never agree to this. both for humanitarian reasons and for political reasons.
Unfortunately, Russia has a rich history of often being an obstacle to sanctions against some of the darkest characters in the international sphere. I'm confident that the Russians can be moved to a position where they can undertake this activity, if that pressure is applied.
Last Friday, the president did raise the pressure, but not on Russia.
North Korea, we imposed today the heaviest sanctions ever imposed on a country before.
Specifically, the administration was targeting those who trade with North Korea, sanctioning one individual, 27 companies, and 28 ships tied to 8 countries, including North Korea and all its neighbors, except for one, Russia.
And there's another question we want to try to answer. How did the North Koreans make the leap and build a rocket that could reach the U.S.? Next, we meet an expert who says the answer may be, well, you guessed it, Russia.
Plus, nuclear missiles and bad haircuts are all most people know about the Hermit Kingdom and its leader, Kim Jong-un. For North Koreans, the reality is far stranger.
I thought Kim Jong-il was a god who could read my mind.
Who could read your thoughts?
Yes.
That young woman's harrowing story coming up. Stay with us.